I'm delighted to be here at the Earth Day Festival. My name is Marc Gafni. I'm privileged to lead with Dr. Zachary Stein and a number of other leading thinkers, a cluster of think tanks. The overarching holding think tank is called the Office for the Future. And subsumed underneath it are two distinct expressions. One's called the Center for Integral Wisdom, and the other the Foundation for Conscious Evolution. The latter was originally started by Barbara Marx Hubbard. Barbara and I worked very closely together. Barbara actually joined the center in the last 5 years of her life. The center itself was co-founded by myself, Sally Kempton, Ken Wilber, and some other wonderful human beings. And we're deep in these questions. So it's really wonderful to be with you today. Now I want to read 3 of the questions and then try and address them directly. The first question is, will human beings survive past the issues going on in the world, socially, politically, globally, and otherwise? That's question 1 that I received. And then I want to look at 2 others. One is, can we change? The way I received the question from the Earth Day Festival is, then it says, can we actually change? Which is funny. Can we change? Can we actually change? Which is a real question. And then finally, the third question I want to look at it is, what, if anything, from our past should be brought to the future? Those are critical issues, and they're at the heart of our thought work and policy work at the think tank. And let me see if I can frame this for 3 or 4 minutes and then try and address the questions with a particular model. And the model is, we call the 3-self model: the psychological self, the mystical self, and the evolutionary self, or parentheses, future self. And let me leave the model aside for a second. The model is enormously important. It's foundational. It's source code changing. I'm enormously excited to share it with you, but context is everything. If we're going to do real work, context is everything. So let me try and, with permission, everyone, set the context. Thank you so much. So we're in a moment in time in which we are confronted by both catastrophic and existential risk. I've spent much of the last 10 years of my life arguing, often vainly, to people that everything we do has to be speaking into this set of questions. And for much of the last 10 years, I felt like I was tilting at windmills. The word existential risk was barely in the conversation. It's a word that was actually coined by Nick Bostrom, who is a kind of student of Derek Parfit at Oxford. Oxford's also my alma mater, where I wrote my doctorate. So it's a place that's near and dear to my heart. And Bostrom coined the term existential risk, and existential risk means the risk to our very survival. Not what will the future be, but will there be a future? And catastrophic risk is risks that, if we don't meet them and ameliorate them, they will engender mass suffering of almost unimaginable proportions, but they won't destroy the future itself. Now, what we've said at the think tank, and we're now publishing this and working to download it into the source code of both public culture and policy, is that existential risk is rooted in 2 primary generator functions, and that those 2 primary generator functions are rooted in a deeper fundamental root cause, and that the only way we can answer the first question positively that the Earth Day Festival is presenting is, will we survive? Meaning, will we be able to respond adequately to existential risk, and bracket also catastrophic risk, is if we actually understand we can do diagnosis. Remember that great, I think it's an English show with Hugh Lowry. And you, if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, I apologize. L-A-R-U-Y, L-A-U-R-I-E, right? It's called House. And House is this great doctor and does diagnosis. You can't treat the issue seriously unless you do diagnosis. Let's engage in diagnosis. What are the core, if you will, I'll borrow a phrase from my friend Daniel. What are the generator functions of what Bostrom calls existential risk? So one, the first generator function is what myself, Barbara Marx Hubbard, have called win-lose, or said differently, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. And in fact, at the Center for Integral Wisdom, together with my colleague, Kate Maloney, and John Mackey, who shared the think tank for a number of years, we ran an event in 2014-15 called Success 3.0. And Success 3.0 was about this issue. What we essentially argued was that the contemporary model of success will destroy our society. We called that Success 2.0. Success 1.0 is the success model of the pre-modern period, obedience to God as envisioned by your particular system, and fulfillment of your particular system's commandments and demands. Success 2.0 is the modern notion of success. Success as achievement, but achievement is generally understood implicitly and explicitly as defined by rivalrous conflict. We're always in competition to get a seat in the medical school, to get ahead in my company, right? In my relationship, in everything, every company, every division within every company, every team is always against another team. Every company is against another company. Every division of a company is against another division within the division. Right? The entire system, all the way up and all the way down, is governed by rivalrous conflict. And rivalrous conflict itself is governed by win-lose metrics, right? We call that Success 2.0. And essentially, what we tried to suggest at that conference, and we had about 1,000 of us gathered, and about 50, 60 kind of thought leaders came from around the world. I had the great privilege of meeting virtually all of them before to actually set up this model. This is a model I conceived together with John Mackey. John was integral to this model. And we said, if we can't move from Success 2.0 to Success 3.0, we're doomed. And we can. And so there's enormous cause for great optimism. We're actually poised between utopia and dystopia. We're not just poised with dystopia looming on the horizon, utopia looms on the horizon. The movement from Success 2.0 to Success 3.0 is completely possible, but we need to envision Success 3.0. And so we're spending an enormous amount of time at the think tank and trying to envision what does Success 3.0 look like? What does that new story look like? But for now, let's identify the first generator function of existential risk is Success 2.0, rivalrous conflict governed by win-lose metrics. The second generator function is what we might call, and we'll borrow David Snowden's distinction related to systems theory. Nassim Taleb talks about it in his way, other people in their way, but it's the distinction between complicated and complex systems. A complicated system, the parts don't know each other. They're artificially put together, but there's no relationship between the parts. So imagine a Ferrari, very elegantly fine-tuned mechanically, but the parts actually have nothing to do with each other. So if one part disappears, it doesn't regenerate, doesn't fix itself, doesn't self-correct. It dies. And if that part's not available from the factory, car's done. The fact that the other parts work doesn't matter. There's no intimacy between the parts. A complex system, think Brazilian rainforest. Brazilian rainforest is a system in which everything's intrinsically related. There's intimacy between the parts. One of the things that we've said in our writing is that the distinction between a complicated and complex system is in a complicated system, there's no allurement between the parts. In a complex system, Brazilian rainforest, there's allurement between the parts. It takes care of its own waste. It regenerates it, as it were, if I can use this term in the broadest sense, it recycles. It recycles. It enriches itself. Complicated system, the parts are dissociated from each other. So for example, let's say someone creates a derivative financial instrument, injects it into the marketplace. That derivative ripples through let's say, the housing market. And the effect of that ripple is that houses wind up being sold to people who can't afford them. We're not checking their mortgages because we're trying to meet a particular system that's driven by these derivatives that are these financial instruments that are created, but the people creating the financial instruments are dissociated from what happens several steps down the road, in which there's a mortgage broker who's selling mortgages to people that can't afford them. And then there's a meltdown. That's part of one of the factors of the financial meltdown in 2008. So when you've got a complicated system, when the parts can't see each other, they don't understand how they impact each other, that system collapses. So exponential technologies in this global system in which people can't see each other when things are moving at breakneck speed, right, generates complicated systems which are, as Taleb says, fragile. So those are the two ostensible primary generator functions for existential risk. But that's not the core of it. You see, underneath the generator functions is a root cause. And the root cause is what we've called a global intimacy disorder. And a book that's actually about to come out, I'm super excited about, by myself and Dr. Zachary Stein, outlines this in just very general detail. It's a book which has 60 propositions about value. Underneath the two generator functions, Rauer's conflict, governed by win-lose metrics, complicated systems versus complex systems, complicated systems in which the parts are dissociated as the two generator functions of existential risk. Underneath is this global intimacy disorder. And the global intimacy disorder means fundamentally there's no intimacy between parts. Win-lose metrics is obviously no intimacy between parts. Complicated systems where the parts are dissociated, no intimacy between parts. It's a breakdown of intimacy. And the breakdown of intimacy is happening all the way up and all the way down the system. And that violates the intrinsic structure and nature of reality. Reality is an intimate universe. And I'm, again, delighted to share that together with Barbara Marks Hubbard, who's passed, but we finished the core draft before she passed, are publishing an entire book on these principles of the intimate universe, which are critical to understand. But let's bracket that for a second. The universe by its nature is intimate, and intimacy has specific sets of meanings, but I'm going to bracket all that. For now, let's just notice there's this global intimacy disorder, and the global intimacy disorder generates existential risk. Now, how do you overcome the global intimacy disorder? Right, which is the root cause for both generator functions of existential risk. So the way you do it is the way you always restore intimacy. So let's say intimacy in a couple. How do you restore intimacy in a couple? And I'm privileged to do, here's a little bit of a sideline I've done for a few decades to work with couples that are close to me and to do kind of deep work with them. And one of the things I've seen over the last 40 years or so is that the breakdown between the couple, the intimacy disorder, is always rooted in a prior collapse, which is the collapse of shared story. If the couple doesn't have a shared story, and particularly a shared story of value, then the intimacy collapses. But that's true not just between a couple, that's true in all kinds of intimacy, whether it's in an organization, whether it's between nations, whether it's within a company, and whether it's, let's say, in the subatomic level, when protons, neutrons, and electrons come together to create a new intimacy, a new whole, a new configuration of intimacy called an atom. But there's shared meaning structures between them, which allow them to communicate. Those are shared value structures, meaning structures, together with my colleague Howard Bloom. He's a beautiful philosopher of science. We've talked about meaning living from the first moments of the Big Bang. There are meaning structures or value structures. Value evolves. Value means something far more elaborate in the human world than it does in the world of matter, the subatomic world. But value means there's a field of value, which means a field of shared meaning. And there's a field of shared meaning and communicative exchanges, even at the atomic level. So let's track this. The generator functions of existential risk, win-lose metrics, complicated complex systems, are rooted in an underlying root cause. The underlying root cause is a global intimacy disorder. The intimacy disorder is itself sourced in a collapse of story, but not just story as a conjectured, contrived story, but the collapse of a story of value, right? A shared story of value. So we might be able to, as we move towards the close now, we might be able to capitulate this really clearly. Intimacy disorders are rooted in value disorders. Every intimacy disorder is rooted in a value disorder. Let's go one more step. What is intimacy itself? Intimacy itself is, and we've developed an intimacy equation in our work at the center. Little parentheses, the name of the meta theory that we're proposing is called cosmoerotic humanism. Cosmoerotic humanism, think romanticism or existentialism, is an entire world philosophy which integrates many meta theories. Within cosmoerotic humanism, we've developed what we call an intimacy equation. I'm not going to go through the entire equation. We don't have time right now, but here's just the beginning. Intimacy equals shared identity. Okay, so now this begins to make sense. When intimacy breaks down, there's no longer shared identity. There's no longer shared identity. Well, then you get rivals conflict based on win-lose metrics, right? Of course. And if there's no shared identity between the different parts of this large complex system, if we're not all part of the system, you have dissociation between the parts, then you get a complicated system, which is fragile. A system only becomes anti-fragile if there's intimacy, which means shared identity. That means that the key invitation of this moment in time is to articulate, not based on the past only, we need to draw the best validated insights from the past, from let's say the traditional or pre-modern period, the best validated insights from all the wisdom streams from the modern period. We need to draw them together, merge them with the best validated insights from the postmodern period. Then we draw all three of those together, the leading edge validated insights in all the wisdom streams from the pre-modern, traditional, modern, and postmodern period, and integrate them into a memory of the future. We need not just to recover the past in order to actually move through existential risk, navigate this 11th hour of our humanity. We need to articulate a memory of the future, which means a new story of value, rooted in first values and first principles. It actually becomes a shared story of value for reality. And it's only out of this kind of what we might call a universal grammar of value, integrating the best of the past, synergizing everything we have, pre-modern, modern, and postmodern, to articulate this memory of the future that draws us forward. Now, you might notice I haven't quite gotten to the model that I proposed. So I'm just going to spend the last 2 minutes on the model, and that's it, because I really want to honor our time frame here. This is just a little snippet, just a tiny snippet of this new story of value. Now I'm going to do 2 hours and 2 minutes. Here we go. Ready, everyone? Okay, we ready? Here we go. Psychological self, which dominates the Western world, is based on the past. The past holds the key. So I do therapy, attachment theory, Gestalt, right? Whatever school of psychology, there's about 11 major ones. But essentially, I'm going into the past to rework my relationship to the past to make me healthy, functional, powerful in the present, and all the best senses of those terms. That's the psychological self. But the psychological self doesn't pay enough attention to a second dimension, which is the present, but the present, not just I'm here right now, but what the Enlightenment traditions call the infinite present, the eternity that resides in the moment, the nowness of the moment. So the first self, a psychological self, puts the entire premium on the past, but doesn't actually have the capacity to access the healing power of the depth of the present moment. So the depth of the present moment is accessed by the mystical self. But the mystical self, of course, ignores the psychological self. It says, just go deep into the present and the infinity. Be here now. At the power of the now, that will transform you. No, you need both the psychological self, the past. You need to rework, engage, transform the past. But we also need the bomb and transformative power that lives only in the depth of this present moment. That's the mystical self, or the enlightenment self, the enlightened self. That's also insufficient. We need a third self. And the third self is the future self, or the evolutionary self, that's called by the future. I can actually hear and feel my future self calling me. One snippet of this new model, we need all three selves, the three self model. One, the psychological self. Two, the enlightened or the mystical self. Three, the evolutionary or the future self. When we access all three, what we've done is we've incorporated first principles and first values, which are the structure of reality. And here's one first principle and first value, and with this we finish. Past, present, and future are first principles and first values of reality. So myself has to incorporate all three. And that begins to emerge a new vision of what it means to be a human being. We just started. We just touched the surface. I'd hope this gave you a fragrance of where we can go and the enormous invitation of the memory of our future. We live, friends, at a time between worlds, a time between stories. It depends on us. And thank you so much for your time.